Hello, Guru Nation. Welcome back to another episode of Random Musings from the Clinical Trials Guru. I've got from Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. Okay, so it's MRCT for short, MRCT Center. I got Dr. Beerer on, and I'm wearing the Harvard hat for you guys, Doctor. I would never would be able to ever have, under any circumstances, gotten into Harvard other than the bookstore. And so I got the hat because I liked the way it looked and I liked the campus. I actually shot a video there on the campus a couple years back. So good times, but I'm glad to have you on because we're talking about diversity in clinical research. This is something that, the industry has always tried to focus on, improving diversity, especially when it comes to female participation, minority participation. It's become something of increasing importance, and the FDA is actually rejecting studies if there's not enough of a diversity in the trial data. So we're going to talk to you about that. We're actually going to talk to you about first how you got into research and a little bit about your background, and then we're going to get into some of the stuff you're doing with MRCT Center. So and also COVID. Let's talk about the COVID-19 clinical research flyers. There's a lot we can talk about, Dr. Beer, so thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about you first so we get some context. Like, who are you and how did you get started? How did you even end up in clinical research?
Yeah, great question. So I'm a hematologist oncologist by training. And I have to say that in oncology and in serious forms of conditions in hematology, the only way to make progress is to test new medicines and to advance, the current understanding towards treatment and cures. So part of the core activity of hematologists and oncologists is to participate in clinical trials. So I trained at Harvard, I trained at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and have always been involved in clinical trials. Then it became clear that a lot of work needed to be done in order to do those well, in order to have oversight and appropriate ethics and conduct in the regulatory environment. And over the years, I've always been committed to that aspect. And increasingly now, I set up the MRCT Center with a lawyer friend of mine, Mark Barnes, who's a partner at Ropes and Gray about 10 years ago, to look specifically at the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment in clinical trials in multinational or multi-site transnational clinical research.
Wow.
Most of the trials that are done, academic trials are often done within the U.S. or locally, but pharma companies generally do global trials. They want their drugs, reviewed and approved broadly, not just in one setting or in one country. So our ability to execute those trials well depends on understanding the local conditions, the regulations, and sort of figuring out how to do that well in all settings, in all cultures.
How are you guys different? Because it sounds a lot like an IRB. Are you guys an IRB, or how are you different?
So an IRB is a review board that looks at specific clinical trial protocols, minimizes the risk, balances risk and benefit, then looks at, the informed consent for a specific protocol. We don't do that.
Okay.
We look at how trials are conducted, including the pretrial data, the study design, the materials that are shared with patients, the education of patients, the review and approval, safety formulations, and try and figure out how to do that in a more patient-centric and respectful, harmonized way.
I got it.
We don't work on specific trials. We don't do specific trials. I've done hundreds of trials in my past, but not now. So one of the ways that, as an example, we were quite dedicated to improving data sharing because, frankly, if a trial is done and the data isn't shared, you can't evaluate that data, and the next company may turn around and do almost the same study, even though we know the answer. So we started working on that, and then that grew to an interesting moment in my life when I was giving a talk on this data sharing, and a patient at the back of the room got up, when we used to do these in person at a conference, got up and said, you spent 6 hours talking about sharing with each other. No one ever tells us the results of clinical trials.
This is true.
And that started a whole work stream on, sort of sharing research results with the participants, both summary, what did we learn from the study that you volunteered for? And then if you say, look, we found out that drug A is better than drug B, the natural question is, what drug was I on? So you have to think about individual results and how to return them and all the different aspects of that.
So is it fair to say, I'm on the website now, Achieving Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in Clinical Research. Is it fair to say that the MRCT Center, the primary stakeholder are the patients, or are your clients pharma and biotech sponsors?
I would say we are neutral in the audience. We certainly have on every work group a diversity of membership, both pharma, biotech, CROs, clinical research organizations, patient advocates, regulators, and academia, and then whoever else is involved in data sharing. It was journal editors, publishers. So not in this case, but there's whoever has a role, because we think that if you get the stakeholders around the table, figure out the problem, and then discuss together possible approaches to solve it, in all likelihood, you'll be that much more successful in achieving approaches and solutions that work for all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised this, I think it's a very important thing that's being done by you guys. I'd be curious to figure out, like, why this hasn't been done before you guys, or if it has, and, how do you keep something like this funded? Like, who's the, how do you keep the lights on doing this?
Yes, we don't get any financial support from Harvard or from the Brigham, but we do have voluntary contributions from pharma companies and from nonprofits like the Gates Foundation, who understand the nature of the work. And then about half our funding comes from grants we write.
Oh, okay, okay.
So, we're constantly, sort of looking for ways to support the work. It's not a typical NIH type grant because it's not asking a research question.
Right.
So they're usually foundations that support us.
And so when you write these grants and you guys do your studies, are you actually enrolling patients in your studies, or these are just like pure like thought studies?
They're policy.
Okay.
They're policy.
Okay. That's interesting.
And then meta research, like, looking at 100 informed consents and saying, what do they say about whether they will return results?
I see.
Or how do they explain to patients whether or not what they're going to do with their, quote, data?
Wow.
Because patients won't necessarily know how to ask that. They won't necessarily think to ask that question. So if it's not offered, right?
Yeah.
And we're big believers that the ultimate reason we all do this work is to improve public health and the care and treatment of individuals.
That's interesting. So I'm glad we have you on because there's a lot of question. There's a lot of places we can go with this interview. I guess the biggest thing is, like, from your years of doing this, what has been the biggest pain points that you've seen in the industry? Is it lack of diversity? Is it lack of the results, like you were saying, to the patients, or so lack of transparency, I guess? Which I think the industry tried to improve that with the Transcelerate, right?
Yes, they are. They are. Everybody is working on these issues now. I don't think they were so sort of top of mind 10 years ago when we started this. But I think that, bringing these kinds of questions to light and focusing on them and publishing on them and making our findings and our suggestions or recommendations visible, it all starts to help. If you ask me to rank order what's the most important thing, I would probably say at this moment, inclusion of appropriate populations in research, sort of nature of why we need research, what the risks and benefits are, and trying to help so are there other issues? There are many issues. The lack of harmonization worldwide, so that each time you do a study in a different country, you've got slightly different rules and regulations, makes these trials much more expensive, much more cumbersome. We went through one experience in a pediatric trial. It's very hard to enroll kids. One experience where in the U.S., the endpoint was at 16 weeks, I think, and in the EU it was 24 weeks.
Yeah.
So you have to make it a much larger study to have an interim analysis at 16 weeks, or why couldn't they just decide on 20 together? So trying to make the world smaller and better and more cooperative and collaborative and less competitive has been a major effort.
Yeah, and Dr. Beer, another issue that I see since I've started in research, I've been doing this since 2005, is
Wow.
the clinical research has a branding problem. I always say this, like, if you go ask the average Joe, the average Jane out on the street, hey, I've got a good clinical trial opportunity for you, they're going to look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you going to experiment on me? I'm not a lab rat. This is like the consensus amongst the general public. Maybe COVID's changed that a little bit because now it's front and center mainstream, but I think there's a branding issue. And even before we get to how do we get more minorities to participate, I think we have to fix the branding issue first.
Yeah. And, it comes out of a history of having done experiments improperly and without the right oversight. And there are risks, but, every time we prescribe a medicine for which there is little or no data, we're taking an experiment, we're doing a micro experiment without learning anything.
Mm-hmm.
So if we only look in clinical trials of patients between the ages of 18 and 65, and then it's approved to market, everybody older and younger can get it, at least in the States where we can prescribe. If we exclude everybody with kidney problems or liver problems and any other kinds of intercurrent illnesses or conditions, and only study people with that condition alone, then you release it. Every time you've got somebody with kidney disease, liver disease, other problems, and this drug, you don't quite know what's going to happen, right?
Right.
So we have to figure out over the time course of product development and then later, after the product's approved, but not waiting for safety events, to use that data and say, okay, now that we've seen a couple of million patients prescribed, how do we develop the data to make sure it's safe and effective for everyone? And it doesn't have to be, in my opinion, exactly the same efficacy. It doesn't, everybody's going to have a slightly different response. It's a bell curve. But you want to make sure it's in the same direction, that it's not worse than other drugs for some.
So do you think the industry needs more phase 4 studies, more of the post-marketing studies?
I think that what we'd love to see is to develop observational data using real world data in a way that can then inform these kinds of questions
Hmm.
with it, and only under certain conditions would you require a true phase 4, but you would want to see more frequent sort of cuts of the data, not
Hmm.
just safety, which they're always very good about looking at, but cuts of the data in terms of age range, comorbidities, or intercurrent problems, and also race and diversity.
Yeah. Speaking of race and diversity, so I'm glad you brought that up again because it's super important that we talk about this, especially now in the times that we're in. These things are all front and center of our attention as they should be. Uh, my theory has always been if you want more minorities participating in your studies, and you meaning pharma, big pharma, small pharma, biotech, whatever, if you want more minorities, you need to go out in those communities and get the clinicians in those communities to do clinical research. Because the majority of PIs are at academia, they're not in the communities where they're treating the minorities. And so one of the things my company is helping do is, hey, we're out there, like we're helping anyone who has a private practice. You want to do research? It's actually not that difficult. There's a few things you got to keep in mind. GCP, you got to have a coordinator, you got to know how to run a protocol. But at the end of the day, being a PI really is not much different than being a regular physician. You're just collecting research data, but you are looking at safety, right? Labs, you're looking at the ECGs, all those things a doctor would do anyways. So I've always wondered why pharma doesn't want to, and I think I have an answer. I mean, it's a lot of work to get a research naive physician up and running. Maybe they're leaving that to people like us to do. But I've always wondered why they haven't invested in those communities where their clinicians are there, but most of them don't do research. Are you do you agree with this, or am I onto something else?
No, no, no. I think that's certainly part of the issue, and that in many, many trials engaging, you know, currently care providers to be investigators would be very, very helpful, and that we can train them and we can help them and we can create infrastructure behind them so that there's some
Yeah.
better fail safe. But that's possible, and specifically to engage not only the care providers in the communities, but underrepresented care providers specifically that care for that populations or those populations. I also think that we have to be more thoughtful about certain kinds of medications or product development that are probably not safe to do as an outpatient in the community that need to be in a hospital. But then we need to really do the outreach to bring those patients in, involve the care provider so that they're not lost to follow up. Right
Mm.
now, or half the time when somebody gets referred in, the person who refers them never hears back, and in fact often loses the patient because they come to them, big medical center, and it's all bells and whistles, and they
Yeah.
start and that is also a problem. um, I also think there are many, many things we could be doing even at academic medical centers that are patient centric, that up till now we haven't done for whatever reason,
Yeah.
for convenience, or including things like you can't have every clinic hour be between 9 and 5 because essential workers can't make it. And you should pay for transportation and pay for the costs. There's no reason that somebody who volunteers to be in a clinical trial should be worse off for volunteering for the public good of society,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's not, some of these things are just not rocket science, but people worry that if I pay people to come or pay for their lost wages, that somehow I'm going to induce them to do something that they wouldn't do otherwise.
Right.
Well, we don't have evidence for that. We have evidence if you give them a huge amount of money In fact, the only data says they'll probably be more suspicious about why are you asking me to do this? And not, well, I have to feed my family. I'm going to do this now.
Right.
So there are some things at the edges, but basically, I think, involving, sort of taking a position of inclusion rather than exclusion. We need a reason to say somebody's not a good candidate for a trial, rather than the reverse, which is we're going to study this very narrow population and use our judgment to see who will do well. So it's interesting, a lot of underrepresented minorities, just to focus on that, are never asked to be in trials. And when they're asked, they're as likely to say yes as white, participants.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, we work here in Los Angeles. We have a huge Hispanic community, and naturally, a lot of our clinics. I own some clinics that do central nervous system disorder studies, so depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, Alzheimer's, things like that. So the majority of our patients are Mexican Americans, and we would love to put them in studies. Unfortunately, the majority of the studies won't allow them to join if they don't speak English.
Right.
Because the scales are, there has to be a certified translator, and they just don't want to go through all that. So they're saying, we would love for you to enroll Mexican Americans in the study, but if they don't speak English, they're excluded. Well, that excludes a whole lot of them.
I reject that. I say, okay, the first time you face this problem, validate your instrument, validate the scale.
Yeah, like the PANS, the CGI. I'm always wondering, Dr. Beer, though.
Why don't we do that?
So my theory is that they're paying licensing fees to like the PANS. Let's take the PANS for example, positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. It's like the gold standard for schizophrenia. So that's in English. Somebody's getting paid every time that's being used in a study. I don't think they have a Spanish version, and I don't think the sponsor's allowed to translate it. So I think that's the issues there. But I don't know. I don't know for sure.
So it's copyrighted, so that they can't do it.
Right.
And it's the sort of quote gold standard. So in my universe of what we want to do, we want to say either you translate it or we develop some other way of including Mexican American or Spanish speaking individuals, which are, after all, a major population that we care for. And it's not as if we don't do some studies in Spain or in Mexico or in Latin America. So what do they use there?
Hey, that's a good question. I got to go find out.
Why aren't we looking to, our world collaborators for best practices? Why do we assume that what we do here is the only way of doing things?
Interesting. Okay, good.
Part of that is the IRB, who says it's okay to do the study and exclude, anybody who doesn't speak English.
I see. So these kind of thing, like this pragmatic issue I just brought up, like this practical thing we deal with on a daily basis, is what your organization actually deals with on a day-to-day basis at scale, right?
At scale. And we say, here are other ways to deal with it. Here are other ways that, they're not available today, but a year from now, if we commit, we should be in a different place.
Next time I get into an argument with my sponsor about somebody who's Spanish speaking wanting to join a study, I'm going to send them over to you, Doctor.
And I will be happy to have this conversation. It's one person at a time to convince them.
That's good. It's very frustrating as a site owner and as a site, like a coordinator, because the doctor, the clinicians, the clinicians speak English and Spanish, so they can translate what the patient's saying on the form. But I guess every sponsor has their own SOPs when it comes to these kind of things. But it's frustrating because look at all the patients, look at all the data that you're basically saying, no, we don't want to include them. We do want to include them, but we don't want to include them.
So, and then if a regulatory agency said, okay, we're going to approve this schizophrenic, this medication for schizophrenia for English-speaking people, You think that would change the tune? I think we'll figure out how to deal with it in a New York minute.
So your doctor can't prescribe it unless you speak English. That would make top headlines on all the news channels.
Well, I mean, we haven't validated that it's the same for Spanish-speaking people. Why
That's
should we
true.
believe it?
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm not advocating for that, but I mean it's a whole system of thinking
yeah,
that we have to say this is no longer the way we want to, do business.
yeah, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. So your organization's doing a lot with that. I always try to look at the positives. I mean, it's really hard to pull positives out of COVID, but you can. I mean, remote work, but one of the things like for our industry, I think is the perception of clinical research has changed a little bit. Now everybody's on the same page. Hey, we need more volunteers in study. We need to get this vaccine out. I hate staying home. I want to go to the movie theater. So we need more volunteers. So I think that's one of the positives. What have you been seeing though, and what is your organization doing when it comes to COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the other major positive, I think, is that we've really adopted decentralized clinical trials. That a lot of work can be done remotely. If you want, to make sure somebody is feeling okay, they don't have to spend 2 hours driving to the center, finding a parking space, waiting for 40 minutes to see you, for you to ask how you feeling. Fine, great to see you. See you next month. I mean, you can do that just as we're doing it here on a video, and even send them a home thermometer and a blood pressure cuff if you need it. So that patient-centricity, I think, is good. We're better at electronic consents and all sorts of remote monitoring and performance, which I think is terrific.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope we don't go back.
Yeah.
I really hope we don't go back for so many reasons. What we're doing is, one, we've focused a lot on how to include diverse minority populations and others in these trials, because I think we've seen it's true in other diseases as well, but in COVID-19, it's clear that the incidence and severity is much worse for minority populations and certain vulnerable populations, incarcerated and sort of institutionalized nursing home.
Yeah, there's an inequality of the COVID outcomes amongst the socioeconomic stratus.
And we don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know whether it's because there are more underlying health conditions, diabetes, hypertension, whether it's because they have to get on a bus to go to work and they're essential workers. And, all of us are sitting at home and working, or getting in our private car to go where we need to go. We don't know whether it's exposure, whether they live in multi-generational homes at a different rate. So all of these aspects of what informs the condition, we don't even have insight into, because we're not collecting the data.
Mm-hmm.
So we're starting, to do a very, as good a job as we can to push for those kinds of interventions, and to make it common that we're all doing it the same way. So when you don't have tiny trials that don't, that are inadequate or underpowered, but you can combine the results of trials or do multi-site trials to get the kind of data we need. We're doing some work on trying to get people to collaborate with each other. We stood up a platform called COVID Collaboration Platform, which covidcp.org, to get people to not run their own tiny little trials that are underpowered and won't give us the answers, but to collaborate with one another. And then we did a whole suite of flyers for the general public about what questions should you ask, how should you approach a clinical trial. So what happened, we were an early hotspot in Boston, really a huge influx of patients. In every hospital, we, abandoned all elective surgery, and all the ICU beds became COVID-19 beds. And people would be in isolation and be asked to be in a clinical trial because we didn't know what to treat or how to treat these patients. And, patients sitting in their room would be approached for a clinical trial and not know whether there were alternatives to treatment, whether they had to, what questions should they ask, etc. So we took a step back and say, if you're sick, if you're thinking about a vaccine, if you have a child, independent of what the research question is, how do you think about being in a trial? What questions should you ask? What should you understand before you say yes? And those flyers we made available, and thankfully a lot of other institutions are picking them up and using them. We co-brand now with whoever wants to, put their moniker on and whatever. And then we've now got them translated into Spanish today. So we'll be releasing those, and we've invited anybody to work with us for other languages. We've done this a little bit beforehand. We developed a whole platform of brochures to explain things like what's an MRI, and then those are all in plain language and translated into 22 languages.
Yeah.
So docs don't have to spend time saying, this is the research procedure. We're going to give you a questionnaire, and then we're going to send you into an MRI. And somebody says, what's an MRI? They're never going to spend time explaining it.
Yeah, I think we need more of that in the industry. I remember, I don't know if they're still around, but there used to be this group called CISCRP or something. Are they still around?
They're still around. They're terrific.
Okay. Yeah, they used to do a lot of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, they do. They do, and we work with them a lot. They're just absolutely terrific.
Okay. So what do you think? What do you think about decentralized trials? Like, do you ever see a time or a day where sponsor will do a trial directly on the patients without sites being involved?
I think, first of all, yes. And there's even been a trial that was attempted to do that way. And I don't think it's likely that big pharma, I don't know about biotech, but big pharma would ever do a trial directly with the patients without an intermediary. Whether that's a CRO with docs or a doc that coordinates that. Mm-hmm. Because for lots of reasons, including privacy and confidentiality, and for having some distance between the sponsor and the patient, I think it's good to think about, partitioning that somewhat. But I think we could do it many trials, much more efficiently than we do now.
Yeah, I wonder if they're sort of gearing up for that so there's been, ever since Patientcentricity, which, by the way, I always thought the industry should be patient-centric, but it seems like only in the last few years you started hearing this word at every conference. So what I've been seeing is pharma, biotech, well, not really biotech, usually big pharma, having these patient influencers, I guess key opinion leader, but patients, and having them, represent them in a way at conferences. So creating protocols, with patients in mind and things like that. Do you think this is something that's real, or is it just like a good publicity for pharma to do this?
Such a great question. So actually, that's one of the grants we're writing right now.
I'm interested in this.
So, there are a couple of different levels to that. First of all, I think it's always better to have patient advocates as part of the process from the beginning. But what you're saying, I think, is that there are some almost professionalized patients as they evolve. And are they really representing the patient interest? I think that is better than nothing. I think what we have to be very careful about is thinking about what is representativeness. And if you have, four or five people, do they really represent the population that you want to involve?
That's right.
And
Especially when they're 4 or 5 well-paid people.
well, yes, but I'm a believer that if you do work, you should be compensated for that work.
True, true.
But I see the point. And I also think that it's very different talking to some, as it were, professionalized, as you said, patients that versus going to the barber shop.
Right.
But it's hard to get that information, which is why I really believe that many of us should be working with trusted intermediaries in the community. To your point, the community health centers that have, community advisory boards that are 51% or more community, who are
Right.
used to thinking about what is the impact for the community, not for the doctor and not for the sponsor. And, so we should be much more deliberate about those kinds of activities.
Yeah.
And all of that will only be good. I
Right.
also think, there's an interesting question that I think we haven't really addressed, which is we let the IRB make a lot of decisions about what's okay for patients.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes the patients say that's okay, even if the IRB says no, it's risky. Why is
Right.
the IRB in a privileged over the patient community?
We can spend 2 hours talking about IRBs, Dr. Beer, because there's been so much consolidation in the IRB space. We're actually thinking of starting a startup IRB ourselves because we keep getting asked from sponsors, "Hey, I don't want to work with these big ones. Do you know any good ones that are reasonable?"
Well,
Not
I know one that's starting.
Yeah, okay.
That's an independent, not-for-profit IRB.
You see, because I have an issue with like these big IRBs that consolidate, and they're basically just getting paid. I mean, their stakeholder is pharma, not really the patient anymore.
Right, right. But I think in general they do a very good job, but there's efficiency, and you're right that the stakeholders are different.
Yeah.
But I'll send you the name of somebody who you should get on.
Okay. Yeah, I get asked like at least once a
Really,
week. At least once a week. Hey, do you know a good IRB? Like not a big one, but a small one that can move quickly and is reasonable. And I say no, I don't. I'm gonna start my own maybe.
I do.
Okay, good.
So,
Please send me that
yeah,
because we're
I
probably
will.
gonna use
I
them.
will.
This has been interesting conversation. I'm very interested in that study you're doing on the patient influencer, or I guess the advocates. Um, I think that's something that if pharma does it the right way, if industry does it the right way, could be huge for them because these patients have a megaphone, especially with social media growing. Uh,
Exactly.
they can fill up a study like this if they were told to do it. The only issue I have that I could see is there's going to be a conflict of interest there. I don't think conflict of interest can ever be removed. It's just going to be shifted somewhere else.
Yeah, but I think if people understand, those motivators, it's not like they're
True.
I think people have to get to it
Yeah.
because everybody's conflicted in
Yeah.
one way or another. And the fact that you're not getting paid, for instance, if you're not getting paid, is a different conflict. You may be biased against it for some reason because you're, sort of feeling used. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that that's true, but I think that what we can explore different avenues for thinking about that. So the FDA gets a pot of money instead of the sponsor,
Hmm. Hmm.
sort of saying, let's bring 6 patients in that we know what they're going to say, and we're going to pay their travel and pay them for their
Yeah.
time. Give an equivalent amount of money to an organization that will choose representative patients and say,
Right.
this is what we're going to do. I mean, there are lots of ways to think about this, but I think hearing from those individuals with the lived experience is incredibly important.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the concern, I like to believe that the average person has good common sense and their BS detectors work most of the time. Sometimes they're hyper vigilant BS detectors, but they work. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully that's because like what you can copy from other industries. I know healthcare clinical research is different, but other industries, they have influencers, and it's disclosed that they get paid, and then people still make their decisions on whether they want to do something or not, have a call to action. So I guess it could be similar in our industry. It'll just be interesting to follow, and we need more organizations like you guys to do studies on these things so we can know for sure, not just speculate on
Right.
what we think.
And how to mitigate the risk so that it's always disclosed. And for instance, there's a fair market value so that people, are the same. So it's not as if you get, a payment from X, you're getting 7 times more than if you were paid by Y. I mean, there are ways of dealing with it so that it becomes part of the work,
Yeah.
and disclosed, and then you can interpret the information through the lens of understanding what the payment structure is.
We're going to put links in the show notes to the uh, website of Dr. Beer's group, MRCT Center. So I'll have the links. Actually, I've been on their website during this interview, so it's really good. They have a lot of different articles on there, almost like white paper on diversity that I saw. So it's a lot of cool stuff. I do want to do follow up when you get the some of these studies going that you guys are
Okay.
doing,
Okay.
and
And
it'd be interesting to follow you guys too.
and I'm happy to, talk to anybody. You can go on the website, find my name and email, and happy to, anytime you want me to argue on behalf of diversity.
Yes. Us
Yeah.
sites need you. Us small sites, community-based sites, we need help because we're just usually told what to do, and if you don't want to do it our way, you don't have to do the study, is what they tell us.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll go. We have other options than you. We've heard this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
When I was ran research at the Brigham, and I started to want certain things in our contracts from the sponsors, they always said, from pharma, they always said, you're the only one who asked for
I
this.
know. I get that all the time.
Like I didn't have friends.
Yeah, they
Like,
want to isolate you, like you're weird for asking this, even though most people are.
yeah, but we'll
Good.
just keep our true north.
Yeah, we got to keep pushing,
Thank you
fighting
so
the good
much.
fight. Thank you, Dr. Beer. Are you on LinkedIn?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'll find you on LinkedIn, put
Barbara
the
Beer.
links under there as well, and we'll have links underneath the show notes. Thank you so much. We're going to do it again. I know
Thank
you got
you.
to go. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening,
Thank
and
you.
we'll catch you all later.